Welcome to Frontline, a podcast that gives voice to the people working at the sharp end of public and community services. This is our four-part special on vicarious trauma.
In this series, we talk about trauma, emotional distress, and the impacts of frontline work. Please take care of yourself while listening. Hello and welcome to Frontline. I'm Andrew James.
And I'm David Gill.
And this is the first part of our new four-part deep dive series into vicarious trauma. Episode 1 will explain what vicarious trauma is and why it's important that we all talk about it. So on that subject then, David, just having a think about it, what does vicarious trauma mean to you and why do you think it's so important that we talk about this?
So it's been an interesting one, this, because this has been like a subject that we've wanted to do for some time, and it has naturally cropped up in so much of previous podcasts, but also just like my day-to-day work. And I describe it as when the sort of trauma-informed approach first came out, when the concept first came out, 10 years ago. The emphasis was on the trauma of the people we support and helping them, and absolutely that's the way forward. But if we do that without taking into consideration the well-being of the staff, there's something missing there. And I think when I first started helping and supporting people about this, about trauma and trauma-informed practice, if I'm honest, I sort of probably downplayed vicarious trauma. I didn't really put the emphasis on it that I feel we should. And there's nothing like a global pandemic to remind people of how fragile our mental health and our well-being can be, to really put this into sharp focus. And in the intervening years, this has come up more and more, and I've done a lot more work around vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, burnout, all of that whole area. And it just kind of reminded me just how important this subject is, and if nothing else, just to talk about it. What about yourself? What's your thoughts on it then?
I mean, what always comes back to me is the thought that people in caring vocations, people in jobs where we support others, where we go in there to help others, it comes from a desire to help, to support, to prop up, to maybe give people a sense of something that maybe we felt we didn't have at a certain point in our lives. Not for everyone, that, of course, but for some people, that may be a motivating factor. But I think one of the things that is almost a constant throughout staff in this, and I'm very much including myself in this, so please, I wouldn't want anyone to think I'm not. We can be brilliant at speaking to someone, empathizing with someone, understanding their pain and their issues, and then providing them with positive solutions to those issues. But we're the absolute worst people in recognizing that in ourselves. It's always, oh, well, I'll deal with that once I need to do this, help this person, deal with this case, and then I'll focus on that. But then by the time you do that, then 3 more people will come along who you desperately, of course, you need to see them before yourself. And it's always putting yourself at the bottom of the queue. That's not to say you should always put yourself first in these situations. Again, it's a caring profession and you're there to help others. But ultimately, if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of anyone else.
And it's so interesting you say that, because when you ask people in this field those questions, at first people like to ignore that. Oh, no, it's not that bad. But when they really think about it, you start to see those cogs turning them to realize absolutely that's what I do. And then what's really interesting is when you sort of ask them to think about their lives out of work, you start to see how that sort of caring profession becomes a caring personality. And you see people who do jobs like this go home and help friends, family, partners, they end up being that person that all their mates go to talk to for advice and help and support. And it's almost like people don't get an opportunity to recharge their batteries. They are just sort of bombarded wherever they go because you know what it's like in friendship groups. Everyone sort of create becomes a character. Everyone becomes a sort of personality, and we just naturally fall into that. We just become who we are, and we just then keep living it. And if you are being that person at home and you're being that person at work, there's no opportunity for you to ever really prioritize yourself to the level that you really, really should. And sadly, when you work in a profession where the complexity is rising up, there is only one place that it's going to lead to, and it's not a great place for people to be. In this first episode, we're asking, what is vicarious trauma? And why should we be talking about it more openly?
Vicarious trauma is the internal shift that happens when people are regularly exposed to trauma of others. It can show up subtly or suddenly, changing how you see the world, how you relate to people, and how you feel in your own body.
It sort of first started for me when I began to sort of like dream about work. So when I'd had like huge incidents at work, I'd sort of wake up in a cold sweat thinking I've missed something crucial, or I could hear like the clients, sort of screams and things like that, and when they were really distressed. And I used to get like this really sick, sinking feeling in my stomach. It's almost like a dread before coming into work.
This is India Ellis, who's worked in challenging behaviour units in psychiatric wards.
And I suppose that took a hold when I started working in the challenging behaviour unit, because we had alarms, you see, and that alarm meant, run fast and as fast as you can, to stop that person from either making an attempt on their life or harm themselves or, attacking staff. It meant there, get there quickly as possible, but be headstrong, present, and get them to safety. And I used to dream about those alarms, and I thought, you know, is it me? Is it a me problem? Am I cracking up here? I didn't get it. Why I was experiencing those emotions.
So, what is happening in your brain when this occurs? The amygdala, an almond-shaped cluster of nuclei located deep within the temporal lobes of the brain, plays a crucial role in the detection of threat and the initiation of the body's stress response. When an individual is exposed to vicarious trauma, the amygdala can become hyperactive. The amygdala is responsible for processing emotions, especially fear. It acts as the brain's alarm system, detecting potential threats and signalling other parts of the brain to initiate a stress response.
Once the amygdala detects a threat, it signals the hypothalamus, which will act as a command centre, communicating with the rest of the body through the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system has two main components: the sympathetic nervous system, or SNS, and the parasympathetic nervous system, or PNS. The SNS prepares the body for the fight or flight response, while the PNS helps calm the body down after the threat has passed. The hypothalamus also triggers the release of stress hormones, such as cortisol and adrenaline from the adrenal glands. These hormones prepare the body to respond to threats: fight, flight, and freeze.
I feel lost sometimes. And because of what I'm feeling and like my way of thinking has slightly changed as well.
This is Anita Hemmings, a team leader working with young adults aged 18 to 24 for St Basil's in Birmingham.
And it's scary, it's frightening, because it's like, who am I really now? I love my job, but I find I don't want to get up in the mornings, sometimes. Certain time, about 4 o'clock in the morning, it'll be like, oh God, I've got to go to bed now. Do I really have to? It's not a weekend, it's a weekday, and I know I've got to work the next morning. I'm less tolerant to things. I actually no longer have that empathy that I would normally have, but I've become numb to everything now. And I think that's sort of what would you call self-preservation. So it's like I'm not ignoring it. I'm listening to what they're telling me, but I can't take it on board. I've got enough. I was like a sponge that soaked everything up, and I'm trying to wring it out, but the water keeps coming.
Terms like burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary trauma are often used interchangeably, but vicarious trauma specifically refers to the psychological transformation caused by empathetic engagement with trauma survivors.
But where did this idea come from? The concept of vicarious trauma has its roots in the early 1990s. The term was first introduced by McCann and Perlman in their 1990 study, which explored how therapists working with trauma patients could develop symptoms like those of the people they were supporting. They observed that over time, even the most experienced clinicians began to experience changes in their worldview, emotional stability, and personal relationships. These weren't symptoms of direct trauma, but of indirect trauma, absorbed through deep and repeated empathetic listening.
Vicarious trauma is therefore interpreted as a transformation in the helper's inner experience, resulting from empathetic engagement with traumatised clients. This phenomenon includes changes in thinking, beliefs about the world, and one's sense of self, safety, and control.
In fact, I spoke to this one of my colleagues. She used to say she'd go home and she'd be exhausted, and I kept saying, "Well, all you do is sit down all day talking to people." But when she said that, I thought, "Oh yeah, that does sound like me." And yeah, and some days I was absolutely exhausted.
This is Dave Wall, a former drug and alcohol support worker.
And I remember one particular incident where a guy was very in your face. It was very difficult to engage. Turned up when he wanted, and turned up very entitled and really aggressive towards me. And it was the last action I had before I went on holiday for 5 or 6 days. And I just thought, why couldn't you have done that on a different day? Because I've come away just thinking, I had to pass him on to some other colleagues to deal with his case over those in the short term. And, it affected me for about 5 or 6 days. There are other instances where people were just in a really tough spot, whether it had been people were, self-harming or threats of suicide, or, their life was just in a really bad spot. And you'd done what they'd done. I'd done interventions and they'd kind of shown signs of improvement. So you naturally, with people like that, you feel a little bit more, invested, a little bit more empathy.
Over time, the concept has expanded to include a broad range of professionals exposed to secondary trauma, emphasising the importance of organisational support, self-care strategies, and resilience building to mitigate its effects. Understanding and addressing vicarious trauma has become crucial in promoting the well-being and effectiveness of those dedicated to supporting trauma survivors.
Their work built on early concepts such as secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue. The term compassion fatigue was popularised by Dr. Charles Figley, a psychologist and trauma expert who described it as the emotional residue or strain of exposure to working with those suffering from the consequences of traumatic events. Compassion fatigue focused on the exhaustion and depletion that comes from caring deeply for others in pain.
And then there's Dr. Judith Herman, whose groundbreaking book Trauma and Recovery helped bring wider attention to the psychological effects of trauma, not only on survivors, but also on those who bear witness to their stories. Herman's work played a major role in legitimising the emotional toll that clinicians, advocates, and support workers often face.
Vicarious trauma expanded the conversation to include the deeper cognitive and existential changes that can occur when we are consistently exposed to traumatic material. Changes to our beliefs about safety, trust, control, and justice.
So, why are we talking about this more now? Partly, it's because demand on frontline services has never been higher. Caseloads are increasing, complex needs are rising, and yet the space for reflection, processing, and support is shrinking. More and more people are leaving the professions they love, not because they don't care, because they can no longer carry the emotional weight alone.
In the UK, the stats tell us this is a growing issue. A British Medical Association survey found that 51% of NHS workers reported worsening mental health due to work-related stress. 71% of GPs in the UK report experiencing compassion fatigue. Up to 20% of UK social workers report PTSD-like symptoms linked to the trauma they witness. And a 2021 NHS England report highlighted that over £591 million in sick leave costs due to stress, anxiety and depression. Many cases likely linked to vicarious trauma.
Someone unexpectedly will present something to you and it will have such a significant impact. It will have a physical impact and it will leave a mark for quite some time.
This is Dr. Ian Calderwell, CEO of Let's Connect, a service that involves individuals and communities in mental health support and well-being.
And I think training to be a therapist, you've got to go through this process of being able to, you want to care, you want to hear people's stories. I know some therapies are very, you have to talk a lot and share everything. And other therapies, it's a minimizing that. And I can see the benefit of both. But listening to people's stories has quite a significant impact. And it's interesting what you would do with that. And I think that's the interesting bit, is what happens, because it can be painful and it can, it can have a, vicarious trauma exists. It can have quite a profound effect on people. So what's people's coping strategies or strategies in general as a result of that? Now, some people will say after a while, you will harden up, you will compartmentalize, and you will try your best not to hear people's story in full, and you can see that happening. And you could also you get compassion fatigue and other things. I think you can get burnt out. People will start to adopt ways of dealing with you, so they don't have to hear the full story. They close it down, and they don't want to deal with it. And quite often services aren't designed to deal with it. So it's a bit of a, how do you survive in a service? Going back when I started off, I was in search of the person who was causing all of this problem. So is it the psychiatrist? Is it the pharmacist? Is it the marketeers? Is it the researchers? And eventually you find no one. It's the system. And over time, you feel really sorry for people who really care for people, who want to do a really good job, and they're put in very difficult situations, and they've got to survive, and they've got to survive by sometimes closing down or shutting off or working in the system and trying to do the best as they can. So I think yes, it can have a personal, physical, and emotional impact, but I think it also then impacts on how you then work, your strategies of survival, of being able to deal with people, not deal with people. And you can understand, I was with someone the weekend talking about his childhood experiences that led him into his own trauma, and then his self-inflicted trauma, and now he helps people or trying to get out of substance misuse and into housing. So he's got a charity set up, and it's his day job. And just listening to him, he didn't go into detail, but you would know that's a harrowing story that person's been through. So that's the part. Do you ask the questions? Are you really interested in getting involved in that person and fully committing to helping that person heal, and healing as in returning to the whole, heal? Or is it a survival mechanism to say that's a housing issue, that's a physical health problem, that's a substance misuse? I just need to fill in the assessment form, use words that don't upset me, and I'll send you on your way. No, that person's isn't going to get the help they need. That someone needs to pull everything together in the whole approach and something in a healing approach, which is an investment of yourself. And I think that their challenges, if you're not fully supported, I think you can do that. But you need to be able to have an organisation that is looking after you and making sure that you're okay and checking in with you, and knowing that if you're going to give yourself, you need to be resourced and re-energized and reconnected and all of them other things.
It's important to note that this is not about weakness. It's about exposure, consistent, often unavoidable exposure to human suffering without the right structures to process it. As Rachel Raymond once said, the expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting we be able to walk through water without getting wet.
There are also increased risk factors for those working in this world. These can include your own personal experience, as well as how much trauma you're exposed to in your role, and whether or not you have the support you need to respond to this. Did you know that trauma comes from the Greek word for wound? Vicarious comes from the Latin, meaning taking the place of another. Hearing another person's trauma can therefore make us feel as though we're carrying other people's wounds as our own.
And the unfortunate thing is, in the job that we do, is sometimes change can take a while for people to want and actually grab a hold of and make the changes they need.
This is Amanda Chalmers, a trauma-informed consultant from Be Informed.
So I've seen it in the work I've done. I train Vicarious Trauma, and it makes people really, really poorly. And you see a lot of people going off sick because they're feeling tired. They may be feeling a little bit down, sometimes even depressed. And I think all of that just shows the type of symptoms that can come from working one-to-one with people that have had lives that maybe haven't been so great, and you're listening to those stories. Luckily for me, I myself, particularly in the prison, listen to a lot of horrific stuff. It just seems that a lot of organisations, and this isn't just the services that I'm used to working in, this is big industry who have billions of pounds as well. They're just not interested in the wellbeing side of things, I don't think. That's the sort of feeling I get, because whenever you start to introduce wellbeing, it's sort of like, okay, well, maybe we haven't got budget for that just yet. All the physical stuff like manual handling, all that kind of stuff is dealt with and paid for, and mental health first aid is what they'll put people on and think that that's great, that's all we need, but actually it's much more than that. And I think right across the board, in any sort of job role and position, there's lots of people that are not feeling great, that are burnt out, unwell, and end up being off sick, or leaving roles when perhaps they're good members of the team as well, and they shouldn't be leaving the roles that they're in. So I do find it really, really sad that, there is simple things that can be done to support staff, but it's just not done. And a lot of ticky box things, such as like, oh, well, we'll give a wellbeing day and we'll do, a few little bits and bobs for staff. We'll maybe do some games, or we'll do a Christmas competition or something like that. That just doesn't sort of start to touch the surface of what's going on underneath for people. What I find as well, surprisingly, in job roles where it's first-hand trauma, where they're going out to basically to scenes that can be horrific, then their well-being is not managed. So I've talked to many a staff member of certain institutions and organisations, shall we say, where they are seeing and hearing lots of horrific things most days, and they're expected just to get on with it. They're expected to pick themselves up, dust themselves off, and crack on again and again and again until actually they break. And I sort of likened it to a rucksack. If you've got a rucksack on your back and you hear stuff or you see stuff that's horrific and doesn't sort of sit well with you, it's almost like you keep putting that into your rucksack. One day your rucksack will get too full, and that last thing that you try to put into it, your rucksack will break, and that's when you break. And it probably will come out of the blue for a lot of people. And I think this is what a lot of organisations and services don't quite understand, is that staff are human and eventually they may break.
This is Richie Andrew from Every Man Can, a non-profit CIC offering programmes for all communities and workplaces.
So from an individual point of view, no one is immune to it. I feel like at that individual level, that people almost need to be able to have it reflected back to them when they're experiencing it. So if they don't see it and it builds up, and obviously that can be catastrophic in some cases, where people don't recognise what's going on.
It wasn't really sort of a hot topic we all sort of knew it was a difficult job and you sort of are given the heads up, but it was more of a just to let you know this is what can go on. Do you think you can manage that? So it was always put onto you. There were no, this is what to do if this occurs. We'd have the sort of the debrief sheet after a huge incident, which was like a tick box exercise. Do you need help from your employer? Yes or no? Them type of things. And it felt more of a chore to complete them rather than be sat with managers and go through them emotions with them and, admit the struggle. So like in some incidences, like I'd be in a safe hold with a client that I'd be having like a PTSD like flashback. And that's sort of when they go back to like their place of trauma. And one particular woman would be saying, please, please, I don't want to, you're hurting me. And you would have to hold this person and sort of ride it out, this flashback that they're having and endure it with them. You'd then sort of write the incident report, your shift would end, and then boom, you're back on a bus home. It's like how do you even transition from that back to like home life? It used to like really consume me. Um, but like only your colleagues would understand that stress because your friends and family who aren't in that industry, they won't get it, you see, and then it'd leave you feeling quite isolated and you'd ask yourself questions and I definitely did like, am I being dramatic or why is it affecting me so much? And I used to be quite tearful.
I guess one of the other reasons why this is a subject I want to talk about, and perhaps one of the driving forces why, like I said, I talk about this in such a hopefully passion in a sort of a passionate way, is that I guess for me, I think back to one point in my career when this sort of hit me quite badly, and I never knew what compassion fatigue for was, what vicarious trauma was. I just felt something happen to me and just assumed that it was my fault. I couldn't handle it, I couldn't deal with it, and I had to just process it and move on. And I remember the more I tried to just push it away, the more it impacted me. It was a time a long, well, say a long time ago. Everything seems a long time ago now, but it was probably about 13 years ago. And I was working a lot with young people. It was the first time I'd done that. I'd pivoted from working with adults, as you well knew, and I moved into working with young people. And it was quite a culture shock for me because you suddenly think I can use all my transferable skills, and actually, no, you've got to learn something completely different. You've got to learn to be down with the kids, which is a lot harder than you think it is. And during my time, I worked with a lot of young people who were looked after children, so been through the care system, were in the care system, had been through all sorts of hell in their life, and were continuing to go through it, abuse, neglect, and we're using things like drugs and alcohol as coping mechanisms. We're missing school, all of that behavior that you would expect from this. And I thought I knew that world. I've, come across it in personal life, seen it in professional life. But when you are sort of embedded into it on a daily basis, I think something within my brain shifted and changed. And I can be quite cynical at the best of times, as you well know. But for a period of time, I changed quite considerably. And at the time, um, me and my partner just having those conversations like you do about the future. And we talked about, she just made an offhand comment one night about children. And I just turned around and went, absolutely not. And just it came blurted out of me. I'd never really thought about whether I wanted or didn't want children. It was, something I didn't think about. And it just blurted out of me this really strong response of absolutely not. And without even knowing anything else, I just let out this whole tirade of why I didn't want children because children in this world are not looked after. There's abuse, there's neglect, there's all this going on. Why the hell would you want to bring a child into this world when this is going on? And it was just something I wasn't expecting. It wasn't really me, came flooding out. And it was really weird because it actually affected who I was as a person. like I say, I can be quite cynical and negative when I'm not in a work environment, but I became a very different person for a period of time. And my relationship, which was solid, suddenly became very shaky because of a one big part of her future that she thought was a deal breaker, that she really wanted children. I made it clear I didn't. And I'm not saying, anyone should be pressured into having children that don't want to have them, but I wasn't making an informed decision at that point. I was making a knee-jerk reaction to the emotional turmoil I was dealing with. And that job was eating away at me. And it wasn't to do with the people I worked with was amazing. The manager at the time, she was amazing. It was just this culture back then. We just didn't have this conversation of openness. We just didn't have these terms that we do now. And it really started to affect me. And it only got better when I changed jobs. An opportunity came up, I moved. And I kind of started seeing things in a different way. I started looking back at my previous job and seeing what I'd kind of been dealing with. I looked at it in sort of a different context. I looked at it sort of looking back and realizing what was happening to me. Obviously, I still didn't have the term of vicarious trauma, but I realized that perhaps that job, I just hit that natural limit. And it wasn't about how strong I was or how good or bad I was. I just naturally hit that limit of doing what I was doing. That's just what I was designed to do as a human being. And yeah, and I kind of saw things and I made different decisions. I balanced things out. I thought about it. And I'm still not sure if I want children, but I guess I've got two now, so I've got to deal with it. But I kind of think if I hadn't left that job, I let that stuff get to me. What would that have done for me? Would it have ended that relationship? Would it made me really bitter and angry? Would I have stayed in that job and been that person in the team that no one wanted to talk to because I was just arms folded negative all the time? And you look back at moments like that and you're just thankful that things lined up in a certain way that you were able to kind of get out of that and look back on it as a learning opportunity rather than perhaps a defining moment that perhaps sent your life in a path you weren't that comfortable with. And I guess so that fundamentally for me is why this is so important because I genuinely do feel it and understand it. And I just wished back, what, 12, 13 years ago, someone would have sat me down and talked through what it is and doing jobs like this, what you're absorbing, what you're seeing, what you're feeling on a daily basis, what it does to you. It might have perhaps not had the impact it did in my home life that it did for a period of time, but thankfully a very, very brief period.
I think this is something that we've always, in the initial podcast series, parts 1 and 2, always tried to get across, which is the importance of positive or the correct cultures and correct structures in organizations, because that wasn't in place for you there. That wasn't set up. There wasn't a way to actually inform and assist people when those issues that are unfortunately inherent in some of the work that we do, when they do develop, if they do rear their head, there wasn't a recognized pathway or an understanding of what to do to deal with that. And in fact, quite a lot of the time, unfortunately, in the worst of cultures of companies, it's almost the exact opposite. They preach you just to bury your head in the sand, carry on. It's related to your strength. You're weak if you can't do it. You got to man up. You've got to soldier on. You've got to keep going. And it's how many colleagues can you think of over your years? And this goes to anyone listening. How many colleagues can you think of over the years? Good colleagues at that, who just in the end had to leave, had to move on, had to do something else because those pathways weren't there, because those cultures weren't correct.
And this is why we are so grateful for the people on this podcast telling their human experiences and sharing how they found their own ways of dealing with it, but also the good practice that is out there when we look for it.
Join us next time on Frontline as we look at what happens for people when vicarious trauma takes hold.